Good morning, and thank you, Fiona. Today we're going to talk about reporting to the board, and I said stroke Audit and Risk Committee for housing associations. Now, which is it? Is it reporting to the board or the Audit and Risk Committee? When I researched this, I couldn't be definite that the Audit and Risk Committee is always a subcommittee of the board and representing the board. So for the purposes of today, I'm going to treat the Audit and Risk Committee as wanting more detail than the board, shall we say. Okay, so let's have a look at today's schedule outline. In a moment, I'm just going to talk about us, the company, and who we are for those of you who don't know us. Briefly, I'll talk about if it's board or risk and an audit committee, who gets what and how much detail. Perennial question is, how many risks should you show the board? You know, if you show them the risk register, because a risk register can have tens, and I've seen ones over 100 risks in it, but that's probably too much detail for any board. We looked at the trends and what's trending at the moment in terms of what are people adding to the reports to the board that maybe weren't there 3 years ago. That's interesting. And then kind of the meat of it is I'm going to look at what sort of detail would be in a report to the board, and I'm looking at that from a monthly, quarterly, or annual basis because I think there's a difference. So let's kick on. And again, those of you who know me know I like to put quotes in at the beginning of my presentations. This is from an American writer of books on business management. And just very simple, the majority of meetings should be discussions that lead to decisions. So if you're submitting a report to a meeting, whatever that meeting is, understand how that report is being used. Certainly, I hope it is being used for some decision. And if there are particular decisions to be made, then maybe your report should reflect the theme of the meeting. Let's say if the meeting is going to have a focal point on cybersecurity and you're the risk officer, then certainly have cybersecurity as the theme of your report as well. No, I think this is telling us that if you're the one who's writing the report, then make it meaningful for the meeting. Okay. Again, for those of you who don't know us, we see ourselves, like many of you, as risk and compliance professionals. And through membership of various bodies like the Institute of Risk Management in London, the Institute of Bankers, Compliance Institute, Chartered Accountants, Information Security, we try to keep our skills as sharp as yours so we can have intelligent discussions with you and with all our customers. As Fiona said, I'm involved in the ISO committee for risk management standards, the TC262, and I chair the national committee. And it's through, I suppose, engagement with peers internationally as well that certainly I'm kept on my toes. Yes, we produce and we develop and we supply a software, generally in a SaaS environment, software as a service, where you can store all your governance, risk and compliance information in one central location. And of course, the idea is that it's easier to report from one central database. We have lots of customers across, I suppose, many sectors, but at the high level, it's financial services and the not-for-profit sectors like housing associations, charities and sports organizations. And we're an approved supplier with the NHF in the UK. Okay, that's us. End of sales pitch. Board versus audit. I think if you're reporting to the board, you got to be succinct. You got to keep the detail in the appendices, if you wish. The board are responsible for oversight of risk management. The board don't manage the risk, and I did read in one document about the board responsible for the management of risk, but it's a responsibility to ensure that risk is being managed, not to manage it themselves. It's the first line, the people doing the job every day who are managing the risk. The board need assurance that risk is being managed, that the controls are effective, that the organization is compliant. And I would say the board also want to know, because they've set the objectives, what is threatening the achievement of the objectives? Is there something we need to be concerned about? Because at the end of the year, the board are happy if the organisation has achieved all the objectives that were set at the beginning. The Audit and Risk Committee, and here, as I said earlier, I'm going to assume it's more than just a subcommittee of the board. Now, it might be chaired by an independent director, and that's fine. But I think the input to that meeting will come from the second and third line, used to be called of defence, but it's the risk management officer, the person who's responsible for directing and controlling the risk management of the organisation, and your internal auditor, who is the third line. And I've put in defence in brackets because the phrase is still used, 3 lines of defence, but it's now referred to just as the 3 lines model, because they recognise it's more than protecting the value, it's also seen as to create value. So it's create and protect. Now, the risk, the second and third line, the risk management officer and the internal audit, who either are this meeting or they're reporting into the subcommittee of the board, they need to assess the adequacy and effectiveness of the risk management, because they need to give this committee and therefore the board that assurance. When looking at the organisation, they need to challenge the first line. They need to challenge, if the controls are effective or if they're the appropriate controls. Certainly the second line, the risk management officer, would be the expert in the organisation as to what constitutes a good risk management process, a good risk assessment process. And so they need to be the one to challenge, cajole, train, educate the first line. The third line, the internal audit, is of course not involved in the design, but can certainly still advise and can comment and opine on the controls. I would say, depending on the size of the organisation, or it doesn't matter really the size, but you need to have consistent implementation across the organisation. Certainly if the information is going to the board, and if it's inconsistent in different departments, that would make for a defective report in my mind going to the board. So it's the second and third line that should ensure that consistency as well. Okay, hopefully that's clear. Taking a different perspective on the same kind of theme. If the meeting is an operational meeting, and maybe the Risk and Audit Committee is an operational meeting, then there will be more detail and there will be longer meetings and more time devoted to it, more risks discussed. And maybe the meeting might be given over to a particular operational area. Maybe it's health and safety one week or 1 month, and maybe it's cybersecurity the next, and maybe it's, I don't know, maybe it's financial the month after. But certainly you'd see more detail. Whereas at the board level, I would see that at the strategic level, high level, linked to objectives. The board has the set of objectives in its mind. It should be hearing whether there are risks that are growing, that are threatening the objectives, and maybe we need to change something. Maybe we need to change the risk appetite. Maybe we need to change the objectives. Maybe we need to find additional resources. But it's summarised information. Now, you still need to do the detail, and we'll talk about that in a moment, but the board wants the summary, if you wish. And we'll get to that. Now, I'm going to show you a few reports, and this would be a boring, what I would consider a boring risk register with and this is just an example from the credit union space, is kind of in my slide deck, but it's showing the category of the risk, the description of the risk, the owner, the controls that are in place, like the inherent level of risk and the residual. Kind of, I would say, the traditional boring detail. Now, if you're going to the board and those risk registers that have, 76 risks, it's too much detail. So pick the top 10 and preferably at a high level. The bit in yellow on this slide is the high level risk. So if we take the top one, and the format is, I'm going to describe in a moment, the bow tie risk assessment technique. And the idea is that the risk is in at the center in the yellow, and to the left, right over on the left, you have the sources. Where can this come from, this risk? Where are the threats, or what are the causes? And then just to the left of it, you have the lower level risks, the more detailed risks. And to the right, you have the consequences. We have confidentiality breach that will lead to reputation damage, maybe regulatory sanction, and maybe you might add in there also claims damages from customers or residents, and then the owner of the risk. And then below, in blue, the summary of the controls that are in place, maybe if there's associated tasks, and certainly the due date on that first one is way overdue. Must speak to this guy, Joyce. And a comment on the risk from the risk officer. Again, it's a summary, and it's not this 40-column risk register that we see so often that still looks like Excel. Things are possible, you know, when you have a database and you have a lot of information in how you present it. This is just one bespoke report. Let me talk to you about the bow tie. Because I want to quickly give you a sense of, if you're reporting to the board at the high level, you want summary of the detail. But if you're reporting maybe at a risk and audit committee, you might want more detail. Indeed, the board would expect that somebody's doing the detail. So let me try and explain how you might arrive at that. If we take this risk, expenditure significantly above target, and that's at the notch of the bow tie, it's a dicky bow. And to the left of the, I'm going to call it risk event or circumstance that you want to avoid, are all of the things you do to prevent that. You know, you'll have policies, you'll have procedures, you'll have limits, you'll have a budget, you'll have monthly reports to try and control the expenditure and keep it within the budget. But if you do go above budget, then to the right-hand side are things you will do then to mitigate or lessen the severity of that. And it might be that you reduce costs elsewhere, you seek additional resources, additional funding, or whatever. So that's the bow tie technique. So I'm going to take you, this is something I've done once or twice before, and I find it works. If you move the knot in the bow tie completely over to the right, you will run risk, which is that your housing association is no longer viable and you close the doors. And then if you consider your objectives, now these are, I would say, generic objectives that might apply to greater or lesser extent to your housing association. And you have maybe 7 or 9 objectives. And then if you put those objectives to the left of the knot and replace the objectives with the relevant, let's say, or equivalent in a risk, you now have, I'm going to say, 7 to 12 risks at a high level. So failed diversification, unacceptable quality of service. These are the high level risks. And if I take the untenable financial position, what could cause that? Just take that as one high level risk. If I move the knot further to the left, I would have maybe 6 risks feeding into that. Failure to manage the existing debt, failure to raise new debt. If sales income is far below expectations or interest rates have gone through the roof, or your expenditure is significantly above target. And all of these are feeding into that untenable financial position. They're, if you like, the causes of that. Now, the board want to know about the financial position and maybe what's threatening it. They don't necessarily want to know the detail about expenditure, but they might ask questions. So I think on a daily operation basis, you're probably managing the 6 risks on the left. And when you're reporting to the board, you're summarizing and putting it into one. Again, because there's only 10 or 15 minutes maybe devoted to this topic at the board, so you want to summarize and be succinct, but you need to have the detail if asked for it. Okay, so I hope that gave you a sense of how you might get reporting the high level summary and yet manage the detail. Now, some trends in reporting generically, and this is, I would say, a world view rather than just a housing association view. I think we've had enough governance scandals over the last few years that governance is now high on the agenda of a lot of organizations. Transparency, being able to demonstrate we have good governance in our organization. So stakeholders, to include everybody, I'll say stakeholders, they want to see that evidence of good governance. So kind of before organizations have been asked, they're including that evidence of good governance, you know, of meetings, of discussions that were had, of responsibility. You know, I think one of the things about governance is that you give somebody responsibility for something, you give them the resources to do the job as well. That's part of governance, the reporting on what you've assigned them to do. I'm not going to educate you on governance, you will know that. And the noise from ESG has got stronger in the last 3 years, but if you look, it had its origins back at least 3 years ago, if not further. Environmental, social, and governance. And the reason I mentioned this here with the housing associations is my reading of it is that if you're an insurance company or an investment manager and you're looking to find a safe place for some money, maybe long-term investment with maybe not the highest returns, but safe returns, part of your due diligence on where you invest will be ESG, because there is now an expectation that on these organizations that have money to invest, to look at the non-financial elements. And I'm just going to move the video from the screen here. Bear with me. It's just obscuring my view. The non-financial factors. So that when an investor, a potential investor in your organization is looking at your organization, they will look at the non-financial stuff. They will look at what are you doing? What are you doing to improve energy efficiency? God knows we all need to do something at the moment. What are you doing with your waste management? What are you doing about diversity and inclusion? So you will be asked these questions. So I think increasingly we're seeing these appearing in the risk and compliance reporting. I've taken a quote from the National Housing Federation's Code of Practice on good governance, and is the board establishes and documents its appetite for the risks the organisation faces in pursuit of its strategy. When you decide on your 7 or 9 objectives, you're taking on risk. The board, in agreement with the executive management, set the limits. I prefer to call it the limits of what you will do and will not do. Generally referred to as the risk appetite. A bad name for it, but it's basically saying how much risk are you willing to accept in pursuit of those objectives. And increasingly in the reporting, boards want to know if the risks that we are carrying here, are they within our appetite? Which objectives are these risks threatening? And finally here on the emerging risks, again, not a phrase that I'm hugely ecstatic about, because I think risk is risk. And if there's a risk of a skills shortage in 2024, then I know about it now. And why is it an emerging risk? It's maybe emerging risk means it's something that we know now, but it's going to become a bigger risk. So I live with the phrase, but you know, identify your risks. And if there is a note to be written on that risk, you might say there is a risk of skills shortage in 2 years' time. We may be short of electrical contractors, we may be short of IT, security people. It's a risk. And I'll get off my hobby horse now and say, why is it an emerging risk? But look, the phrase is out there, and it generally covers things that are, let's say, coming down the road at you. The regulator is changing the rules, and from January next year, you now have to produce this report or comply with that regulation. Yeah, you need to know about that, and you need to be prepared. Okay, there are kind of the trends. When I started writing this, I thought, if I'm a director, there's certain things I want to know. And if I'm the risk management officer reporting to the board, there are certain things I want the board to know. So I did 2 slides trying to express both perspectives. If I'm a director of an organization, a non-executive director, then I want to know what our risk-bearing capacity is. Now, what does that mean? Well, we the directors have to set the risk appetite, the limits, how fast you can go. The car is in there for a reason. I use the car as a metaphor in a lot of webinars. And I would say to you, you need to know how good the brakes are. before you decide on how fast you're going to go. How fast would you go with no brakes? Right? So you need to know how good the controls are in an organization, the capacity, the capability, the skills and knowledge of the organization. Clearly, an organization has been doing this for years and have well-trained people, good, mature policies and procedures, have done this before, can take on more risk. So you have a greater capacity for risk. As a director, I need to know that. And once a year, and we'll see this, there needs to be some communication to the board that readdresses that or updates the board with that information as the capacity. What structures are in place? You know, who's managing the risk? How has it been organized? What are the arrangements, if you like, within the organization in terms of responsibility, and have people been trained? I want to know if the controls are effective, because in every single corporate governance code, you will find that the directors are responsible and have to attest as to the effectiveness of controls. So it is the director's duty to ask and not just listen to internal audits saying, yeah, the controls are effective. If I was a director, I would be challenging and I would be asking. I would ask if there's any incidents. Have we had any cybersecurity incidents in the last month? And if the answer was, I don't know, well, that's not a good answer. I prefer to hear the answer, yes, we've had 3 attempted brute force attacks, but we repelled all of them. And I can tell you, we have brute force attacks on us nearly every day and we repel all of them, but that's normal. But I know we're repelling them. Have there been any audit findings? And what are we doing about them? Are all the risks within our appetite? And if they're outside, if any are outside, what are we doing about it? Are we compliant with all regulations? Because non-compliance is a risk. It's one big risk with a lot of detail behind it. I want to know. And finally, and this probably applies to everything, not just risk management, is there anything that the management team need from the board to enable better management of risk? And maybe it's a relaxing of the risk appetite, that it's felt that we were too conservative. Maybe it's more resources. But tell me, I'm a director, tell me. Now, I'm the risk management officer, and I know some of your organizations, you may not have somebody dedicated risk management officer, but somebody has the responsibility, and it might be the head of finance. If I was responsible for risk, if I'm the second line of defense and I'm gathering all that risk information to report, I want the board to know the 10 risks that keep me awake at night. I want the board to know what we've done since the last board meeting to manage the risk. If you have the evidence that we are constantly trying to improve. I want the board to know the impacts that their decisions are having or have had. If you change your policy, if you think about it, if you decide we're going to have nothing to do with asbestos, any building with asbestos in it, we don't want to have anything to do with it. Well, a decision like that will have ramifications through an organization. Now, maybe you don't, maybe I picked a bad example there, and you don't have anything to do with asbestos already. You outsource that to somebody who does it. But just as an example, the sort of things you may have to change controls if it's health and safety, and there's you can imagine with the pandemic the changes in policies and procedures that happened as a result of the pandemic. And the last one that I put in, the risk appetite is too limiting. The board need to know that if because it's a limit, and if it's preventing you from taking risks that I as an executive feel we have the capacity and capability to do this, then I got to make the case to relax that limit and let us do that. Now, here's an interesting one. I, as the risk management officer, I want the board to know the loss events, those incidents. I call them incidents, loss events, risk events, whatever you want to call them. Because this is intelligence. This is telling you what's happening on the ground and reflecting the environment. In my experience as a professional manager, 95% of incidents are not a person's fault. It's bad process or it's external influence. So I'm happy to share that information. because I want people who are making decisions to be aware of reality on the ground. Okay, that's me, possibly. Now, as I said, I think the Risk and Audit Committee is working at a more detailed level. And certainly if this is the committee that's preparing the report for the board, or if it's the risk officer and the internal audit person preparing a report, they need lots of evidence. Evidence that all relevant risks have been identified. Have you got all the risks? How did you choose the risks? Was it sat around a table and said, oh, I know, and can we pull them out of the air? Or is there some structure to that? Is there some taxonomy? And maybe a bottom up, maybe it's top down and bottom up. So they need to gather that evidence so that they can give the assurance to the board that all relevant risks have been identified. The controls are effective. And that's monitoring. You won't find that out in 1 week. There needs to be a program of monitoring, and maybe over a period of 2 or 3 years, you check every single control and that it is effective, and you look for evidence that it is effective. By effective, if the control is technology to review the server event logs every week, well, one, is it being done? And what do the logs tell us? And do they tell us if there is anomalous behavior and somebody trying to hack in? And were we able to use that information to effectively ensure the defenses are working? Like I said, you won't test them all in 1 week, but have a program. Do the people who are managing the risk on a day-to-day basis, and that's people on the first line, the risk owners, do they have the skills and knowledge to manage the risks? Have they been trained to know how to assess and analyze the risk? Importantly, are the risks within the appetite? You will have some, obviously, clearly within the appetite. You'll have some that are, I think, borderline, and some maybe that are outside. This committee needs to know that, because they need to have a plan to address them. They need details of plans from the people who are doing them to address the known gaps and the findings. They need details of any incidents since the last meeting, again, so they can analyse it and give the assurance to the board that this is under control. And I think there'll always be a bunch of risks that are stubborn, you have to accept them because it's part of your business, but you're concerned, and there needs to be a closer monitoring of these risks, maybe a daily or weekly control that is implemented to keep on top of it. Could be energy pricing. Now, I'm going to just quickly kind of go through reporting and what might be in a monthly report. You have 15 minutes to communicate the message. I would say graphics, use graphics. Put the detail in text in the appendices if you have to submit, and usually do well before the meeting. But at the meeting, focus on the graphics and not so many words. If there's a theme to the meeting, in a monthly meeting, then your report will probably be slightly different every month. This month it's cybersecurity, next month it's health and safety, etc. If there are regulatory requirements that need to be addressed, remember the compliance and the concern of the board is that we're non-compliant, because that can trigger a lot of negatives. I think you need to highlight that in the report. And if you've been asked to respond or to do something in the last, you need to show those responses. If you've been asked to investigate or come back and report, include that in your report. If you, as the risk officer who's reporting to the board, if you have concerns on the trends, you need to communicate those concerns to the board. And all of this in 15 minutes. And don't forget, if you're looking for approval or a resource, don't forget to ask. So what to include? Significant risks. I would be including just the top 10, maximum 15, but top 10. And you might even take the numbering out of it. I know in some organizations, they remove the rating, because when you get to that level, it doesn't matter if something is number 4 or number 5. They're all risks of concern. Consider it. Trend. Directors want to know, is this getting worse or getting better? My bottom graphic here just shows 2 new risks, the blue dots, and the rest are all the same. If we're getting worse, it'll be a red arrow going up, and getting better, a green arrow going down. I'll talk about key risk indicators because I think this is an important one. And I came across a description some years ago from Ariane Chappelle, I think it was her name. So I give credit to her for the 4 headings here: exposure, stress, causal, and failure indicators. Because we often tend to just show the failure indicators, but force yourself to have at least one in each of these categories: exposure indicators. And often things that you can't control, but certainly affect your business. You know, energy costs must be a significant concern for you guys. Stress indicators. And this is where the people or the resources you have are being stressed, and you need to know that. You know, if it's a case of sick days have gone up, you've got to start asking maybe why. And maybe it's because the same people are trying to do 30% more than they were doing last year, and you really need to add more people to the team. The complaints are going up. It might be an indication of standards slipping and residents complaining. I would have a stress indicator if you're dependent on third parties. Significantly have some stress indicator that might reflect if they are being stressed. Something that will tell you that. Causal indicators are, if you like, early KRIs. For example, if you measure the number of open positions, and if that is increasing, then you can imagine that in 3 or 4 months' time, then those unfilled positions are now being covered by other people who are now even more stressed. But you've got to ask the question, why are we failing to recruit people on time? Why do we have so many open positions? And it might be that your pay structure is out of kilter with what the market is paying. It might be that you have a bad name as an employer. You need to do something about your reputation. So look at those causal indicators. If it's equipment age, and I had this some years ago when the piece of equipment we had was 8 years old, IT, a backup system, and it started failing as much in 1 day as it did in 1 month. And we replaced it before it failed completely. And then the last one, the poor performance, complaints is a good one. Incidents, guys, if you're not getting reports on incidents, loss events, risk events, and they don't have to be big incidents. It's often the small incidents that are precursors to big incidents. Okay, enough on that. Here's a little graphic that using the spark line in Excel. It's often not a figure. Energy costs of 180 means nothing. But if I can see that the energy costs have been growing over the last 4 quarters significantly, and the trend is still upwards, that's the key risk indicator. It's the trend, isn't it? Okay. This is another report, and I'm putting these just up as examples of because no one size fits all. But this is a report on a risk. We call it the 360 report. And you got the risk, you got the objective that's impacted, you got any incidents that related to the risk, any results from monitoring questions, things that you might ask weekly or monthly, and any tasks. So it gives the broader picture. This is more of a compliance picture. And think about it, there's 123 colored squares here. And in the space of seconds, you can see that there's a lot to do in this information, cybersecurity. What we want is a lot of green, and we certainly don't want any red. So think how you will report in a short space of time. Okay, quarterly report, you might have 30 minutes, so you can give a bit more information. I'd still be putting a summary on page 1, and I'd be putting the graphics on page 2 and maybe a few pages of graphics, and put the detail behind. I think on a quarterly basis, and maybe you only have quarterly presentations to the board, but you will compare the previous quarter generally, so that you can highlight maybe trends, not always visible month to month, but certainly quarter to quarter might make more sense. You might, over a period of a year on a quarterly meeting, pick one area that you will drill down deeper into, because you've got 30 minutes. So pick, cybersecurity. It's a concern for most boards. So dedicate at least one quarterly meeting a year to cybersecurity. And again, changes in regulations in the sector. You might delve a little bit deeper. What's coming down the track next year or the year after? Yeah, that's just another example of tasks, stuff that you've done since the last meeting, and it could be with the graphic as well. things you do. Just samples. This is an incident dashboard. Again, pictures often communicate the message a lot faster. You know, the number of incidents, the areas of the incidents, the trend. You know, pictures are good, folks. Pictures are good. And kind of finally on the reporting it annually, and this is a different one. I'm going to assume you've got an hour. The board needs to assess at least once a year the effectiveness of the risk management function. And is it working? I have in brackets here framework. Think of it as the arrangements, you know, the plan, do, check, act of management around risk. Is it working? And maybe in that annual meeting, if you're the risk officer, you show the full 97 risks and show that 87 of those are well managed. I'm not worried about them. It's the top 10 I'm worried about. But you need to know as a board, this is our risk profile and this is what we're doing well, because that communicates something too. If you're on a 3-year plan to be the best at risk management in your sector, you're not going to get there in 3 months or even a year, I would say, depending where you're starting. But consider a maturity model. Now, I've written down here good, better, and best, but I'm thinking of changing that from now on to foundation, building on top of the foundation, and then sustaining. And the idea is that the foundation, and this is level 3, is kind of, I'd say minimal. You're ticking the boxes maybe from a compliance point of view, but you're no better than anybody else. I don't think anybody has a goal to be just doing the minimum. But you don't get to be the best. You don't go from a 3 to a 5 overnight. It's a maturity model. You have to grow into it, and you focus on different areas and the things you can do better. So again, I do a webinar purely on that topic. But if it might be that you start with basic information, basic reporting, and then you extend it to more extensive, cover the whole organization, all risks, all assets. And then at the highest level, the way I describe it to people is, you're good, but you're not happy. Why are you not happy? Well, because you know you can be better. And it's that culture of continuous improvement. It's not negative. It's just saying, okay, we just 2 incidents last month. Let's try and bring it down 50% to one the following month. And you're constantly, and it's keeping their foot on the accelerator. And as soon as you say, we're good and now we don't need to do anything else, you start going backwards. So it's just, to my mind, it's culture. But once a year, the board needs the big picture, because they need to have that reassurance and that detail that this is working. I think once a year as well, and probably after the strategic plan has been issued, have this discussion. So you align your priorities for the next 12 months. And if there's things in the strategic plan that weren't there the previous year, it might introduce new risks, probably, and you need to address that as well. And finally, just some takeaways. Depending on how often you report to the board, but there will be different formats, and cut your cloth to suit monthly, quarterly, or annual, but at least one annual, you need to have that detail. Do check with the recipients of your reports that they are getting what they want, and you're not giving them the wrong detail or too much detail on anything. Supply the detail, if you like, and supply it well in advance of the meeting. But I would use graphics at a meeting. People can read people don't want to read the detail at a meeting and don't expect them to be reading the detail. I think because the board ultimately decides what resources go to the people responsible for managing the risk, communicating with the board is ultimately going to determine the success of your risk management efforts. Now, one of my colleagues suggested that why wouldn't you give the board access to the live data and let them go in and see the reality? Yeah, that's a brave move. Might get more questions than you intended, but I thought I'd put it out there just to provoke a bit of conversation. So that's me, folks. I did go over the 35, but I hope it gave you enough what will I call it, provocations. Enough. The Germans have a great phrase for it, actually. I lived in Germany for a while, and they call it thought kicks, where it's provoking you to think things maybe that you weren't thinking of before. So, we're never going to solve the problem in a short webinar, but I hope through these webinars that people are getting good ideas for where they might look. So, Fiona, do we have any questions?
Not as yet, Jerry. Just give it a minute or two, and maybe if there aren't any questions, we'll leave it there. And people can also always email with questions if they come up later.
Happy to take questions by email as well, folks.
There's one question now. How would you report on the second line?
How would you report on the second line? For those who mightn't be familiar with the 3 lines model, the first line is the risk owners. The second line is I'm going to say the chief risk officer, or it could be the chief compliance officer. So it's the person or persons, so you might have a department, who are cajoling, training, guiding, teaching the first line on how to manage risk. The second line are the experts in this. They understand the risk management process. Now they need to summarize the information. We see in so many organizations that the risk officer ends up doing the work of the first line and in putting in the risk assessments. I would encourage you to get the first line to fill out what they think the risk is, because the first line have more information than the second line. They see it every day. They see what controls are working. So the second line has to get the first line to fill out the information. So the second line reports to probably the CEO and the board separately. And the second line needs to collate all that information. The second line, I would say, would create that report for the board that summarizes the risk and can give the assurance that the controls are working. The second line, I always see it as the second line is reporting to the board. If the risk and audit committee is kind of the in-between, where the longer meetings are held, and then it's a shorter one for the board summary, and people say, yeah, we've discussed this in detail. But I think it's the second line is gathering the information, checking that the controls are working, challenging, and documenting that work. The Audit and Risk Committee, or you alluded to it, Rachel, the Audit and Risk Committee. So if I'm the risk officer and I'm reporting to the Audit and Risk Committee, I would treat them as the board. I would show the summary risks, but I would have available the detailed risks behind me. I would show what we've done in the last month to address the risks, what initiatives we've taken, maybe what training, what procedures we've written, what policies generally written higher, but what procedures we've written and implemented, what controls we have tested, what the plan is for the next 3 months in terms of the controls we've tested. I think if you look, and you get the slides afterwards, there should be enough promise in there. I don't think there's one size fits all. So I think I would start by asking the Risk and Audit Committee if they have, what's the word? I don't want to say an idea, but do they have a concept of what they want to see? Certainly satisfy that, and I would, like in my presentation, give people what they want to see, but there's probably things you think that they should also see, and I would include that as well. But my starting point in any report would be, what's the purpose of the report? And let that guide you. What's the purpose of the report? Is this going to be used in a decision or multiple decisions, because it might be a focused report on one particular topic, health and safety, cybersecurity. So, yeah, the purpose of the report.
Great. And that's it.
Okay.
There aren't any more.
Yeah, we've gone over the time, but thank you for staying with us. Thank you for your time today. Keep an eye out for future webinars. Always happy to welcome you back. Thank you all, and thank you, Fiona.
Thank you.